The great station of Kethvara hung in the void between stars like a jewel made of light and metal. And within its halls walked the representatives of a dozen spacefaring civilizations who had ruled this part of the galaxy for 6,000 years. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the viewport of the UES Olive Branch and watched the station grow larger as her ship approached. And she felt the weight of human history pressing down upon her shoulders, because she was about to introduce her entire species to the galactic community. Behind her stood 20 Marines in their finest dress uniforms, their boots polished to a mirror shine and their rifles held at perfect attention. And this honor guard represented a tradition that stretched back centuries, to a time when humanity still fought its wars on a single pale blue world. The docking procedures took 3 hours because the Vorath hegemony insisted on scanning every molecule of the human vessel. And when the results came back, the aliens made no effort to hide their amusement. High Arbiter Zinthale was a creature of flowing robes and crystalline skin that shifted colors with his emotions. And right now, those colors swirled with shades of purple and gold that Elena had been told indicated contempt mixed with entertainment. "You may approach the Council of Species," Zinthale announced in a voice that resonated through the great chamber where hundreds of alien diplomats had gathered to witness humanity's introduction to civilized space. Elena walked forward, with her head held high and her Marines marching in perfect formation behind her. And she could feel countless alien eyes studying her, measuring her, and finding her wanting before she had even spoken a single word. "I am Ambassador Elena Vasquez of the United Earth Government," she said in a clear voice that carried across the chamber. "And I bring greetings from the 8 billion humans of Earth who wish to take their place among the stars." Zinthale made a gesture that caused holographic displays to appear throughout the chamber. And these displays showed the scan results from the human vessel, with particular emphasis on the weapons the Marines carried. "Tell me, Ambassador," Zinthale said with colors that now blazed with open mockery, "what exactly are these devices your soldiers carry?" "Our sensors detected chemical propellants and simple metal projectiles, and we assume these must be ceremonial artifacts from your primitive past." A ripple of laughter moved through the assembled aliens, and Elena felt her Marines stiffen with anger behind her, though not one of them broke formation or showed any outward sign of their feelings. "Those are rifles, High Arbiter," Elena replied calmly, "and they are the standard combat weapons of Earth's military forces." The laughter grew louder, and Zinthale's colors shifted to bright orange, which indicated disbelief and amazement. "You cannot be serious," the High Arbiter said, "because every species in this chamber abandoned kinetic weapons thousands of years ago when they developed plasma technology and energy-based systems. And the idea that your soldiers would carry such antiques into battle is simply adorable." A creature that looked like a walking spider made of black glass stepped forward and spoke in a clicking voice that was translated by the chamber's systems. "The Kethmari find this most amusing because even our hatchlings have toys more sophisticated than these human weapons. And we propose that humanity be granted protected species status so that they might be safeguarded from the dangers of a galaxy they are clearly not ready to face." More aliens voiced their agreement, and the chamber filled with sounds of approval. And Elena realized that her species was being offered the galactic equivalent of a seat at the children's table. "We also detected bladed weapons on your soldiers," Zinthale continued with obvious delight. "And please tell me these are not also used in combat, because the very thought of beings intelligent enough to achieve space travel still swinging sharpened metal at each other is almost too precious to believe." Elena turned to look at Sergeant Major Rodriguez, a man whose family had served in Earth's military for 5 generations. And she saw the cold fury in his eyes, though his face remained perfectly still. "The combat knife is a tool of last resort," Elena said, used when all other options have failed, and a soldier must fight at close quarters. The chamber exploded with laughter, and even Zinthale seemed unable to control his amusement as is. Crystalline body flickered through a dozen shades of mocking color. "How delightfully barbaric," the High Arbiter declared. "And we truly mean no offense, because your species is clearly very young and has simply not had time to develop proper weapons. So we offer you our protection and guidance as you learn to take your place in civilized society." Elena felt something shift inside her, and she recognized it as the same feeling her ancestors must have felt when larger nations looked down upon them and assumed they would be easy to conquer. The United Earth government thanks the Vorath hegemony for this generous offer, Elena said in a voice as cold as space itself. "But we must respectfully decline, because humanity prefers to stand on its own feet." A shocked silence fell across the chamber, because no species had ever refused protected status before. And Zinthale's colors faded to a confused gray as he struggled to understand what he had just heard. "You refuse our protection," he said slowly, "even though your weapons are primitive and your technology is centuries behind the least advanced species in this chamber." "We refuse," Elena confirmed, "and we thank you for your time." She turned and walked toward the exit, with her Marines falling into formation around her. And the chamber buzzed with confused conversation as the aliens tried to understand what had just happened. In a shadowed alcove overlooking the chamber, General Kethmaros of the Vorath Military Command watched the humans leave with eyes that had seen 1,000 battles. Across 100 worlds, his aide leaned close and asked what he thought of the primitive newcomers. And for a long moment, the general did not respond. "The others laugh at their weapons," Kethmaros finally said. "But I watched their soldiers throughout the entire humiliation, and not one of them showed fear." His aide seemed confused by this observation and asked why that mattered. Because a species that is truly primitive would have been terrified to stand in that chamber surrounded by their betters, the general replied. But those humans were not afraid. And that means either they are too stupid to understand their situation, or they know something that we do not. He watched the doors close behind the last human soldier. "I do not think they are stupid," he said quietly to himself, "and that thought troubles me greatly." 6 months after the humiliation at Kethvara Station, humanity found itself facing its first true test among the stars. And that test came in the form of a world called Arcturus 7 that both species claimed as their own. The planet was rich in minerals that could power starships for centuries. And both the Vorath hegemony and the United Earth government had filed colonization claims under different interpretations of galactic law. Colonel Marcus Chun stood in the command center of the UES Defiance and watched 30 Vorath warships emerge from faster-than-light travel, their hulls gleaming with energy shields and their weapons ports glowing with barely contained plasma. "That is quite a welcome party," Captain Sarah Oduya said from her position at the helm, "and I count enough firepower to glass a dozen worlds." Colonel Chun nodded slowly and felt no fear, because fear was a luxury that commanders could not afford. And instead he felt the cold clarity that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done. "Signal the other ships," he ordered, "and prepare to hold position because we are not leaving." The human fleet consisted of 5 vessels that looked old and tired compared to the Vorath dreadnoughts, and enemy sensors dismissed them as barely functional transport ships held together by hope and rust. This was exactly what Colonel Chun wanted them to think. On the surface of Arcturus 7, the situation grew more tense by the hour, as both sides deployed ground forces to protect their mining claims. And the Vorath landed 10,000 soldiers equipped with the finest weapons. Galactic civilization could produce Sub-General Euthran commanded the Vorath ground forces, and she was a warrior of great reputation who had crushed rebellions on a dozen worlds without ever losing a single battle. She reviewed the human deployments with something approaching pity, because they had landed only 800 soldiers armed with those ridiculous chemical weapons that the entire galaxy had. Laughed about, the humans have made this easy for us, she told her officers, because they have sent barely enough soldiers to delay us for an afternoon, and their primitive rifles will bounce harmlessly off our personal shields. Her officers laughed and began planning what they assumed would be a simple cleanup operation across the rocky terrain that separated the two forces. Colonel Chun gathered his Marines in a natural amphitheater surrounded by steep cliffs, and he looked out at the faces of men and women who had trained their entire lives for a moment like this. "You all know why we are here," he said in a voice that carried across the silent gathering. "And you all know what the galaxy thinks of us, but I need you to understand something important." He paused and let the weight of the moment settle upon them. Those aliens have been fighting wars of display and intimidation for thousands of years, and they have forgotten what real combat looks like because they wave their fancy weapons around until someone surrenders. An actual bloodshed is considered uncivilized. A cold smile crossed his weathered face. We are about to remind them what war really means. The Marines made no sound, but Chun could feel their readiness like a physical force, and he knew that every single one of them would follow him into the fire without hesitation later that day. Sub-General Yuthran broadcast an ultimatum across every frequency, and her message was received not only by the humans on the surface, but by observers across the entire sector, primitive Earth forces. You have 12 hours to withdraw from Arcturus 7, or you will be pacified with extreme prejudice. And I offer this warning only because the Vorath are a merciful people who take no pleasure in crushing those who cannot defend themselves. The message was arrogant and condescending, and exactly what Colonel Chun had expected from an enemy who had never faced a true challenge. He recorded his response and sent it without consulting Earth Command, because some moments required a soldier's answer rather than a politician's careful words, "Come and take." 3 words that echoed across the galaxy and made the assembled observers lean forward with anticipation because they had expected the humans to beg for mercy or negotiate a face-saving retreat instead. The humans had issued a challenge that no Vorath commander could ignore without losing. Honor Sub-General Yithrin received the message and felt her blood burn with anger because no primitive species had ever dared to speak to the hegemony with such disrespect. They have chosen extinction, she declared to her officers, and we will grant their wish before the sun rises. As darkness fell across Arcturus 7, the Vorath forces began their advance toward human positions, and their soldiers moved with casual confidence because their forester shields glowed with protective energy, and their weapons hummed with barely contained plasma. They expected a quick battle against outmatched primitives. They expected easy victory against creatures who still used chemical propellants and sharpened metal. They had no idea what was waiting for them in the darkness. Colonel Chun watched the enemy approach through night vision equipment that turned the black landscape into shades of green. And he saw 10,000 aliens walking toward their doom without any concept of the violence that was about to be unleashed upon them. All units report ready. His communications officer announced. Chun took a deep breath and felt the weight of what he was about to order. And he knew that the next few hours would determine whether humanity would rise or fall among the stars. He had trained for this moment his entire life. His father had trained for this moment. His grandfather had trained for this moment. 100 generations of human warriors stretched behind him, and their knowledge flowed through his veins like fire. Weapons free, Colonel Chun said quietly in the darkness. 800 Marines opened fire. The first Vorath soldier died without understanding what had killed him, because his personal shield was designed to deflect plasma bolts and energy beams, and it had no protocol for stopping a simple copper-jacketed bullet traveling at 900 meters per second. The projectile punched through his shield like it was not even there and buried itself in his chest. And he collapsed to the rocky ground while his comrades stared in confusion at his body. Then the night erupted with the thunder of 800 rifles firing in coordinated bursts. And the Vorath advance transformed into chaos within the span of a heartbeat. Sub-General Yithrin screamed orders into her communication device as her soldiers fell by the dozens. And she could not understand how primitive weapons were cutting through shields that had stopped plasma fire from a dozen different species. "Recalibrate the shields," she commanded, "and find the frequency they are using." But there was no frequency to find, because bullets were not energy weapons that could be analyzed and countered. And they were simply metal moving very fast through the air until they hit something soft. The Vorath had not defended against kinetic weapons in 3,000 years because no civilized species used them anymore. And their shields had been optimized for threats that actually existed in modern warfare. Humanity had never stopped using bullets because bullets worked in the darkness. Sergeant First Class Diana Okonkwo led a 12 Marine squad through a drainage channel that intelligence had identified before the battle. And they moved in perfect silence toward the glowing lights of the Vorath command post. She had grown up in Lagos hearing stories about her great-grandmother who had fought in the resource wars of the 22nd century. And those stories had taught her that the most important weapon a soldier possessed was not a rifle but the willingness to close with the enemy and destroy them. The command post held 200 Vorath officers and their support staff, and they were so focused on the chaos at the front lines that they never heard the humans emerge from the darkness behind them. Diana gave the signal, and her Marines attacked with rifles blazing and bayonets fixed. And in 15 minutes of brutal close-quarters combat, they killed every single alien in the compound. She lost 3 soldiers in the assault, and she would carry their names in her heart forever. But the mission was accomplished, and the Vorath ground forces were now cut off from their command structure, back at the main battle. The Vorath tried to use their neural disruption grenades, and these devices were supposed to overwhelm enemy nervous systems with targeted electromagnetic pulses calibrated to specific brain chemistries. The grenades did nothing to the humans because human brain chemistry was not in any galactic database. And the weapons that had ended wars against 6 different species simply made the Marines feel a slight tingling sensation. Why is nothing working? Sub-General Yithran screamed as another wave of her soldiers fell to gunfire that should have been stopped by technology that had protected her people for millennia. She ordered her troops to fall back and regroup. But the humans did not let them retreat in good order, because that was not how humans fought. Marine fire teams pursued the fleeing Vorath and cut them down from positions they had prepared hours earlier. And every rock and every ridge became a killing ground where alien soldiers died in confusion and terror. Yithran finally understood that she was not fighting a primitive species that had stumbled into space with outdated weapons, and she was fighting a species that had perfected the art of killing long before they ever dreamed of reaching the stars. She called for orbital bombardment because surely the fleet could simply destroy the human positions from above and end this nightmare. Colonel Chun had anticipated this response because human military doctrine had studied Vorath tactics extensively, and he had positioned his forces in terrain that sheltered the very mineral deposits the Vorath had come to claim. If they bombard us from orbit, they will destroy everything they came here for, he told his officers with grim satisfaction. And that is not a price their leaders will be willing to pay. He was correct, because the Vorath fleet commander refused the bombardment. Requestin told Yithran that she needed to handle the situation with ground forces alone. The battle raged through the night and into the dawn. And when the sun finally rose over Arcturus 7, it revealed a landscape covered with Vorath bodies. 3,000 aliens lay dead across the rocky terrain, and their advanced weapons and glowing shields had done nothing to protect them from bullets and grenades and the terrible efficiency of human violence. Humanity had lost 47 Marines, and Colonel Chun personally recorded each name so that Earth would remember. The price of this victory, Sub-General Yithrin stood in our field headquarters and looked at casualty reports that she could not process because nothing in her experience had prepared her for losses on this scale. Vorath wars were fought with careful maneuvers and displays of technological superiority until one side acknowledged defeat, and actual combat deaths were rare because civilized species did not engage in wasteful slaughter. The humans had not followed these rules because they did not know these rules existed, and they had simply tried to kill as many enemies as possible using whatever methods worked best. Yithran composed a message to High Command and chose her words carefully because she needed them to understand the magnitude of what had happened. "We have made a terrible miscalculation," she wrote, "because these humans do not fight the way civilized species fight, and their primitive weapons are not primitive at all, but rather perfectly designed for a single purpose." She paused and forced herself to write the truth that her people needed to hear. They are designed to kill, and the humans are very good at killing, and I do not know if we can win this war. Far across the galaxy, General Kethmaris read her report and felt the cold weight of vindication settle in his chest because he had warned Council that the humans were dangerous. And now his warning had been proven correct in the blood of 3,000 Vorath soldiers. "Prepare my fleet," he ordered, "because I need to see these humans for myself." The Vorath hegemony responded to the disaster on Arcturus 7 by sending 50,000 additional soldiers to crush the human forces through overwhelming numbers. And transport ships filled the sky like angry locusts descending upon a field. Colonel Chun watched the enemy reinforcements land and felt no despair because he had expected this response. And Earth had sent reinforcements of their own in the form of 2,000 additional Marines. More importantly, Earth had sent a division of combat engineers. Sergeant Major Rodriguez led the engineering teams across the landscape surrounding Firebase Prometheus, and they worked through 2 sleepless nights planting devices that the Vorath had never encountered and could not have imagined. Minefields stretched across every approach route and were designed to detonate when alien feet stepped upon them. And these simple pressure-triggered explosives would tear through shields that were still not calibrated to stop kinetic force. Booby traps waited in abandoned buildings and along forest paths, and tripwires connected to fragmentation grenades that would shower advancing troops with deadly metal shards. Defensive fortifications rose from the rocky ground as Marines dug fighting positions and constructed bunkers with overlapping fields of fire. And every position was placed according to calculations that maximized the killing potential of human weapons. The Vorath commander who had replaced the disgraced Sub-General Yithrin was named Fleet Marshal Virkith, and he was considered one of the finest military minds in the hegemony. He studied the human positions through orbital sensors and saw nothing but primitive earthworks that seemed almost pathetic compared to Vorath energy barriers, and he planned his assault with the confidence of a predator stalking wounded prey. "They have dug holes in the ground," he told his officers with contempt, "and they believe dirt and rock will protect them from our plasma cannons. So we will teach them otherwise." He ordered an assault column of 8,000 soldiers to advance on Firebase Prometheus through a valley that seemed to offer the most direct approach. And his troops moved forward with shields blazing and weapons charged. They never saw the mines buried beneath the soil, and the first explosions tore through their formation like the fists of angry gods. Soldiers flew through the air in pieces and shields that could stop plasma bolts shattered under the concussive force of simple chemical explosives, and the survivors tried to retreat only to find that more mines waited behind them. Human artillery opened fire from positions hidden behind ridgelines, and mortar shells fell among the trapped Vorath like deadly rain, and each explosion scattered shrapnel that cut through armor and flesh with equal ease. The survivors who escaped the minefield and the artillery found themselves channeled by terrain into a narrow killing ground where Marines waited in prepared positions, and overlapping fields of automatic weapons fire created a wall of bullets that nothing could pass through. 4,000 Vorath soldiers died in that valley in less than an hour, and Fleet Marshal Verkith watched through orbital cameras with growing horror as his assault column was systematically destroyed. "This is not possible," he whispered. He ordered a night assault because surely the humans could not see in darkness, and his troops advanced under cover of night with confidence that they finally held an advantage. They were wrong because human soldiers carried night vision equipment to turn darkness into shades of green, and the Vorath walked into ambush that they never saw coming. Marines appeared from hidden positions and opened fire at point-blank range before melting back into the shadows. And Vorath soldiers fired wildly at enemies they could not see, while human bullets found them with terrible precision. By the 5th day of the battle, Fleet Marshal Verkith had lost 20,000 soldiers and had gained not a single meter of ground, and his remaining troops were beginning to show signs of fear that Vorath warriors had not displayed in generations. Colonel Chun sensed that the moment had come to end this battle, and he authorized Operation Hammerblow, with the full knowledge that it would cost human lives, but would break the enemy completely. The assault began at dawn with every mortar and artillery piece firing in coordinated barrages that forced the Vorath to keep their heads down. And under this cover of suppressing fire, the Marines advanced in fireteam formations that had been perfected through centuries of human warfare. Close air support arrived in the form of atmospheric fighters that strafed enemy positions with cannons and rockets, and the roar of their engines added to the chaos that consumed the Vorath line's infantry. Squads moved from cover to cover with one team firing while another advanced. And this basic tactic that every human soldier learned in basic training was completely unknown to enemies who had fought wars of position and display for millennia. The Vorath broke because they could not comprehend enemies who came at them through fire and death rather than waiting for an honorable surrender. And their retreat became a rout as soldiers threw down their weapons and fled toward their landing zones across the galaxy. Species that had dismissed humanity as primitive children watched the battle footage with growing unease, and they began accessing human historical records to understand how such a young species could fight with such terrible effectiveness. What they found horrified them. Humans had been killing each other since before they discovered fire, and every generation had produced new and more efficient ways to wage war, and their entire history was written in blood and measured in body counts. The other species had achieved space travel and then slowly forgotten how to fight because they no longer needed to. But humans had carried their warrior traditions with them to the stars, and those traditions were now being demonstrated with devastating effect. General Kethmaros arrived in the Arcturus system with the Vorath Grand fleet of 200 warships, and he broadcast a demand for total human surrender that was heard across the entire sector. Colonel Chun received the message in his command bunker while medics treated the wound in his shoulder, and he looked up at the sky filled with enemy ships and felt no fear at all. "You have fought well for primitives," General Kethmaros announced. "But this battle is over because no ground force can stand against orbital bombardment. So surrender now, and your soldiers will be treated with honor." Colonel Chun smiled and recorded his response with blood still drying on his uniform. "You're too late." General Kathmaros did not understand what the human meant, and that confusion would cost him everything. General Kathmaros stood on the bridge of his flagship and prepared to give the order that would end the human resistance forever. And his 200 warships hung in orbit above Arcturus 7 like executioners waiting for the signal to strike, target all human positions, he commanded, and prepare for orbital bombardment. His weapons officers began the targeting sequence while the general allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, because the humans had fought better than anyone expected, but nothing could stand against the firepower of the Grand Fleet. Then his sensor officer spoke in a voice that trembled with confusion. "General, we are detecting missile launches from the asteroid belt." Kathmaros turned to look at the tactical display and saw hundreds of small objects streaking toward his fleet from positions that had been hidden among the tumbling rocks for days. "What are those?" he demanded. The 5 human ships that everyone had dismissed as barely functional transports had not been idle during the ground battle, and they had been hiding in the asteroid belt waiting for exactly this moment. They were not warships because humanity had never developed energy weapons sophisticated enough to threaten Varath shields, but they were missile carriers loaded with a very different kind of weapon. Captain Sarah Oduya of the UES Defiance watched the missile streak toward the enemy fleet and felt the fierce pride of a warrior whose trap had finally been sprung, all missiles running hot and true. Her weapons officer reported the missiles were simple by galactic standards, because they were just metal casings filled with fuel and guidance systems and nuclear warheads, and they had no energy signatures for point defense systems to track. They were also moving very fast. General Kathmaros screamed orders to his fleet as the missiles closed the distance, and his point defense cannons opened fire, but they were designed to intercept plasma torpedoes that moved at predictable speeds along predictable paths. Human missiles did not follow the rules because they jinked and weaved through random, evasive patterns that had been programmed by engineers who had spent decades studying how to defeat exactly these defenses. The first missile struck a Varth cruiser and detonated with the force of a small sun, and the ship's shields did absolutely nothing because they were designed to stop energy, and these weapons were just mass-moving, very fast nuclear fire consumed the cruiser in an instant and spread to nearby ships in a chain reaction of destruction that lit up the void like a new star being born. More missiles found their targets and more ships died in nuclear flames. And General Kathmaros watched his fleet being torn apart by weapons that his people had abandoned as primitive 1,000 years ago. "Why are our shields not stopping them?" he demanded. His science officer answered in a voice hollow with despair. "The missiles are kinetic weapons enhanced with nuclear warheads, and our shields were never designed to stop physical objects because no civilized species has used such weapons in living memory. In 11 minutes, 143 Varath warships were destroyed or crippled by human missiles, and the proud Grand Fleet was reduced to burning wreckage scattered across the orbital space of Arcturus 7. General Kathmaros barely escaped with 57 surviving vessels, and he retreated to Varath space with the knowledge that he had just witnessed the end of an era. The Battle of Arcturus 7 was over, and humanity had won. High Arbiter Zinthale received the news in his chambers on Kethvor Station, and his crystalline body flickered through colors that no one had ever seen before, because he was experiencing emotions that his species had no name for. "How is this possible?" he asked. "The empty air." He ordered a complete analysis of human weapons technology and expected a report of hundreds of pages detailing complex systems and hidden advances that explained their impossible victory. His analyst delivered a single page Every weapon they possess was designed with one purpose. The report read, and that purpose is to kill as efficiently as possible without regard for elegance or tradition or display. And they are not primitive at all, but rather perfectly specialized for violence in ways we had forgotten were possible. Zinthale read the report 3 times before he could accept its truth. The Varath hegemony requested formal peace negotiations, and they no longer offered humanity-protected species status because the galaxy had learned that humans did not need protection. Ambassador Elena Vasquez met again with High Arbiter Zinthale in the same chamber where her people had been mocked and dismissed. And now the alien diplomats looked at her with something very different in their eyes. "We must understand," Zinthale said with colors that swirled in confused patterns, "how a species so young could develop weapons so effective. And our scientists have studied your technology and found nothing sophisticated. So how did you defeat us?" Elena thought about her answer carefully because she knew that her words would be heard across the galaxy. And she wanted every species to understand exactly what humanity was. "We practiced on each other for 10,000 years," she said simply. "And you were never our first war, and you were not even our 100th. Because before we ever dreamed of reaching the stars, we spent millennia learning how to kill each other as efficiently as possible." The chamber was silent as the assembled aliens absorbed this truth. "Your weapons are designed to impress and intimidate," Elena continued, "but our weapons are designed to end lives quickly and in great numbers. And we are very good at using them because we have never stopped fighting. And we never forgot the lessons that your species learned to forget." High Arbiter Zinthale looked at the small human woman standing before him, and he finally understood that the galaxy had been sleeping safely for thousands of years only because it had never encountered a species like this. The treaty was signed, and humanity was granted full standing among the galactic community with all the rights and privileges that the Varath had once mockingly denied them. But there was something else in the way the aliens looked at humanity now. And it was respect born of fear, and fear born of respect. And every species in the chamber knew that the galaxy would never be the same 50 years later, when the devouring swarm emerged from the galactic core and began consuming entire worlds. The Varath hegemony and the other civilized species found themselves facing an enemy that their elegant weapons could not stop. They knew exactly who to call. The message reached Earth in the early hours of a spring morning, and it was a desperate plea for help from species that had once laughed at human weapons and called humanity primitive children playing with dangerous toys. The response came from the United Earth Military Command, and it was broadcast across every frequency so that both allies and enemies could hear "We're coming." And across the galaxy, the devouring swarm would learn what the Varath had learned on Arcturus 7, and what every human enemy had learned throughout 10,000 years of bloody history. Some species are not primitive. Some species are simply very good at war, and humanity was the best. The stars had never seemed so cold as they did on that morning, when the sensors first detected the approaching fleet. Commander Thalrix stood aboard the observation deck of the HFY flagship and watched the holographic display with the boredom of someone who had witnessed this scene 1,000 times before. The 7th Armada stretched across space like a wall of death. 4,000 warships moving in perfect formation toward the small blue planet called Earth. To Thalrix and his people, this was nothing special. The HFY Dominion had conquered over 2,000 species across 40,000 years of galactic expansion. They had broken empires that spanned hundreds of worlds. They had crushed civilizations that had existed for millions of years before the HFY had even learned to make fire. And now they had come for humanity. Thalrix pulled up the intelligence file on his display and read through it with mild amusement. Humans were a young species, barely 300 years into space travel. They had colonized only 17 star systems. Their total military fleet numbered somewhere around 340 vessels against 4,000 HFY warships. This was not a battle. This was an execution. The High Command had designated this mission as a routine harvest operation. Within a single planetary rotation, humanity would either surrender and accept integration into the Dominion, or they would be destroyed. There was no third option. There had never been a third option. Thalrix noted something curious in the human file. These creatures still practiced something called war games amongst themselves. They simulated conflicts and trained constantly for battles that they fought against each other. Most species in the galaxy had evolved past such primitive behavior long ago. The HFY themselves had not needed to hone their combat skills for millennia because no one had ever offered them a real challenge. But humans apparently treated warfare as a skill to be practiced and perfected. How amusing. Thalrix thought how utterly pointless. The Armada dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, and the standard surrender ultimatum was broadcast on all frequencies. The message was simple and direct. Humanity had 12 hours to submit to benevolent integration. Those who complied would be shown mercy. Those who resisted would be eliminated. The HFY had sent this same message to 2,000 species before. Most surrendered immediately upon seeing the size of the Armada. Others lasted only slightly longer before their worlds burned. Thalrix expected the humans to respond within the hour, begging for terms. Instead, there was silence. The hours passed slowly as the Armada continued its approach toward Earth. Still no response came from the humans. Some of the younger officers grew restless, but the fleet commander remained unconcerned. Perhaps the humans were simply too shocked to respond. He suggested perhaps their primitive communication systems had failed under the stress. Perhaps they were already fleeing their homeworld in whatever ships they could find. It did not matter, the result would be the same regardless then. Exactly 12 hours after the ultimatum had been sent, a single transmission arrived from Earth. It contained only 2 words and a set of coordinates. "Come closer." The fleet commando laughed when he heard it. The other officers joined in, their amusement echoing through the bridge. These humans clearly did not understand their situation. They were inviting their own destruction with foolish bravado. The Armada adjusted course toward the coordinates the humans had provided. It was a location near the orbit of the 5th planet, a massive gas giant the humans called Jupiter. Perhaps they hoped to make some kind of desperate last stand there. Perhaps they thought the planet's gravity would somehow protect them, whatever their plan. It would fail. Nothing could stop the 7th Armada on the bridge of the UTS Persistence. Fleet Admiral Yenna Chun watched the approaching enemy fleet through the main view screen. She had not slept in 40 hours, but her eyes were sharp and her mind was clear around her. The officers of humanity's combined defense force worked at their stations with quiet efficiency. There was no panic, there was no fear, there was only focus. Admiral Chun had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. Her grandmother had been one of the architects of the United Terran Defense Force. Her mother had commanded the first Deep Space Patrol fleet, and now Chun herself would lead humanity's stand against an enemy that expected them to break. The alien armada grew larger on the view screen with each passing minute. 4,000 warships against 340. The numbers were impossible. Any rational analysis would conclude that humanity had no chance of survival. But Chun knew something that the HFY did not understand. Humans had never been rational about survival. They had never accepted impossible odds as a reason to surrender throughout their history. They had faced extinction countless times. Ice ages had nearly frozen them out of existence. Plagues had killed half their population. Wars had ravaged their civilizations, and yet they had always survived, not because they were the strongest or the smartest or the luckiest, but because something deep in the human soul simply refused to stop fighting. The Vethkai saw humanity's small fleet and assumed this would be easy. They did not realize that they were not facing a collection of warships. They were facing 10,000 years of military evolution. Every human vessel was designed around a simple philosophy that other species had long forgotten. War was not about honor or glory or fair fights. War was about winning, and humans had spent their entire existence learning how to win against impossible odds. Admiral Chun turned to her communications officer and gave a single order: send the signal across the human fleet. 340 ships came alive. Systems that the Vethkai sensors could not identify began powering up. Crews that had trained their entire lives for this moment moved to their battle stations. And in the depths of space around Jupiter, hidden among the moons and asteroid fields, other things began to wake. Things that humanity had been building in secret for 200 years. Things that the galaxy had never seen before. Thalrix noticed something strange on his sensor display. The human fleet was not retreating. It was not scattering in panic. Instead, those 340 tiny ships were holding their position, almost as if they were waiting for the Armada to come to them for the first time in his long career. Thalrix felt something he could not quite identify. It was not fear exactly. The Vethkai did not feel fear, but it was something close, something that whispered in the back of his mind that perhaps this conquest would not be as routine as everyone assumed. He dismissed the feeling and returned to his observations after all. What could 340 ships possibly do against 4,000? He would have his answer soon enough, and it would haunt him for the rest of his life.